In World War II, the army tended to pick up the dead and wounded as they went along. Fighting in large groups meant that there were always witnesses to any casualties. But this wasn't the case for the Navy. Ships would go missing far out at sea, so the Navy always followed the ethos of burial at sea. If a ship sank, the dead went to the seabed with it. Sailors not accounted for were not classed as missing unless the fate of the ship itself was unknown. That's why sunken ships are classed as war graves. But most of the RAF men would have crashed over land because that's where the battles were fought. Recovery of these bodies was necessary for identification, to give the relatives closure, and because it was unacceptable not to give these chaps a decent burial. Hi, I'm Frank, and in this video we're going to look at the work of the people who were responsible for clearing the wreckage of the RAF. At the outbreak of war, the mechanisms for dealing with crash sites were in their infancy. Between the wars, most maintenance and salvage operations had been contracted out to private firms for budgetary reasons. But in the mid-30s events, especially those in Germany, they sparked a series of expansion schemes which would make the RAF capable of fighting a war. Those accelerated after 1935 when talks with Adolf Hitler in Berlin led to the belief that the Luftwaffe could now take on the RAF. But the problem was that these schemes focused wholly on frontline squadrons. No attention was paid to either reserve forces or the administrative branches needed to keep these squadrons flying. As late as September 1938, on Air Vice Marshal Welsh's advice, Maintenance Command was created. Repair, including wreckage recovery and salvage, came under the remit of 43 Group. 43 Group were to be run by the RAF at various maintenance units. Teams of 8 to 10 men worked under the direction of a crash inspector. After looking at the facts, he would give a broad judgment of how it should be dealt with. This could be complete recovery of airframe and engine, or simply filling in a crater and moving on to the next. A single engine fighter, for example, would create quite a debris field, depending on the angle of dive. The wings and parts of the rear fuselage would most likely break off on impact and spin away over the ground. At any angle, the engine being the heaviest part would dig itself 15 to 20 feet into the ground. Now this may not seem much, but with only shovels and a mobile crane, recovery was almost always impossible. Then there were the time restraints. The Air Ministry made it clear that the priority was removing visible RAF wreckage without delay. During the Battle of Britain, the sight of downed RAF planes littering the countryside was unacceptable, and these wrecks contained valuable, much-needed spares. The German wreckage was left where it crashed until studied by the RAF Technical Intelligence Office, then cleared for removal and taken away. Soon, because of the workload, the RAF had to fill in the gaps in their own strength with civilian contractors. Usually working in teams of 2 or 3 men, These were mostly inexperienced in this type of work and had even less specialist equipment at their disposal. The result was that most crashes were dealt with in a hurried manner. If the pilot's body or parts of it were visible, they'd be removed, but very little would be done to thoroughly check the cockpits. It's not uncommon now for the wrecks of aircraft whose pilots have known graves to be excavated only to find the remains of limbs and lower torsos still in them. Now you'd expect there to be a public outcry about the swiftness that wrecks were swept up, but there was none, as the RAF didn't advertise these crashes, so nobody knew. Also, a lot of the crew had no contactable next of kin. It's worth noting that although the RAF was predominantly British, there were Polish, Czech, French, Belgian, Norwegian and other foreign crew who had fled to Britain after their countries fell. Along with Indian, South African, Australian, Canadian and New Zealand Air Forces, this made the RAF a truly multinational force. After the chaos of the Battle of Britain, things improved gradually, and by 1944, 43 Group had 750 low loaders and 170 cranes at their disposal. A total of 31,668 aircraft were dealt with by 43 Group in 1944, an absolutely massive amount. The United States Army Air Force had begun to arrive in Britain in 1942, and their salvage organisation was in its infancy too. 1,400 American aircraft were dealt with by 43 Group in 1944. It's worth mentioning enemy aircraft and crew and how they were dealt with. If the wreck was of no technical or intelligence interest but still recognisable, it could be handed over to local authorities to raise money through war bonds, Spitfire funds or the like. Enemy dead were treated with respect. The bodies would be recovered and sent to the local civil mortuary. The body would be buried in the local military approved graveyard. 3,800 German servicemen are buried in Britain. Funerals were conducted with due ceremony, complete with national flag. Details and photographs of the funeral will be forwarded through the International Red Cross to the Germans. Thanks for watching.